And so I tackle him into the surf. She goes, "Oh no." Exactly.
Right, yeah. Oh, jeez.
So shall we get serious?
Let's do it.
All
So
right.
I guess so.
So welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel, my co-host, Anthony Weber. With us again is Brandon Everest. Thanks for coming back.
Happy to be here.
And also I'd like to introduce Diane Emling. She's a retired sociology professor from NMC. She was there for 30 years. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Today our topic is From Henry Ford to Sam Walton, the rise and fall of the middle class. Now, this is obviously a pretty timely topic. If you just turn on the news, it's certainly relevant. And I had been thinking lately about Henry Ford and that old saying we've heard over the years that he wanted to build cars that were of a certain price, but wanted to pay his workers enough to be able to afford them. So he was kind of creating his own customers, right? I mean, I don't know if there's much truth in that, but that's the old saying. And not so much with Sam Walton in this era of everything's cheap, everything's from China, all the globalization going on. And so I think Anthony and I were wanting to dive in a little deeper, get some thoughts from the two of you of what the heck happened between those two big named, I guess, businessmen in the history of the U.S. Any thoughts?
Several. I guess I'll jump in. One thing is that in the day of Henry Ford, there wasn't a huge consumer audience because there weren't that many reasonably paid people. So he did create his own market by paying his own people enough to buy his cars. Over time, we've had a growing upper middle class and above, so there are a lot more people to buy things. The other thing is, which I really learned when I spent a week or so in China, is that the middle class is growing so fast in China that we almost are not really the consumer market that drives production. The growing middle class in China and in India make us as consumers much less relevant than we used to. So it used to be that you felt like you had to have a United States market and people well enough paid to buy things. But people are much less worried about whether we can afford to buy things here because there are so many other people, very large populations, other places in the world.
So you're saying we're not ruling the world anymore?
We're not
ruling.
Yes. Our middle class is not ruling the world anymore.
Middle class is not ruling the world anymore. Yeah, that is just a really big change. We don't have to count on the numbers of people, even though we know that 2/3 to 3/4 of the economy is predicated on consumption. If we can grow middle class as other places, then they can consume our products. And that really changes the calculus for any variety of things that are related to the rise and fall of the middle class, no doubt.
So what is fueling the rise of the middle class in places like China and India?
A lot of it, I think, is modernization. In China, as they have moved to some more competitive market economies, there is a lot of growth, there's a lot of industry, there's a lot of construction and housing and things like that.
The same kind of development, you know, on this notion of modernization, the same kind of development that happened here is happening in other places. So as their division of labor becomes more complex and there are more and different kinds of jobs that will afford, you know, based on skills and other assets, other human capital, it's going to mean that some people are going to be making more money over time. And the classes within those societies will grow, middle classes will develop, and the same kind of processes that we saw happen here with industrialization are really happening there, but on a much quicker pace, and also with all the benefits of technology built into that.
Scope. Yeah,
which
and a
is
big
amazing.
part of what's fueling it other places, I think, is technology, because they are not having to go through all the stages that we did with, you know, hardwiring everything and relying on fossil fuels and all that. They can just jumpstart into cellular technology.
Piggybacking off our technology that we spend all that time to create.
Right.
But they do have a lot of people who are involved in high tech. They have a lot of people who are involved in finance. So as they grow, all those type of sectors become more important than they used to, bring in more people.
Brandon, you said something about our products, selling our products to the middle class in China and India. But isn't it our middle class that's actually manufacturing and creating our products? So how is that balance shifting as well? What kind of products are you talking about?
Yeah, well, increasingly, Americans are not producing the products that are being sold abroad. So when we say our products, I guess I should say more specifically, transnational corporations that are based in the United States are selling products abroad that are also being manufactured and assembled by cheaper labor forces abroad. So one thing that I don't think that we can ignore here when we think about the rise and fall of the middle class is that what has led to the fall of the middle class in the United States has led to the rise of middle classes in other places in the world. And we have sort of, in essence, I think, traded the American middle class in many respects for the rise of other middle classes elsewhere.
And then we have like the Walton phenomenon. When we say that we have a trade deficit with China, what we mean is that United States corporations, which means basically their stock trades on Wall Street, that's what makes you United States. You do business around the world.
Right.
But you go overseas and find very, very low income people at very low wages to make your products, you import them back into this country. So the trade deficit is US companies building and producing other places and then bringing them back into this country. It's not like we're buying indigenous Chinese products and that's why we have a deficit.
You know, Brandon, were you suggesting that there's a zero-sum game to the middle class, globally speaking, that if a middle class rises elsewhere, a middle class somewhere else is going to suffer for it, or is there a way in which globally a middle class can rise?
Well, I think we have to be careful when we use zero-sum analogies, and I didn't necessarily mean to say that. But short of a zero-sum game, we have to acknowledge that these are relationships that are interdependent in the global economy, so that where there are fluctuations in one place, you have effects taking place elsewhere. It's not zero-sum. But the thing is that the sorts of jobs that have left America are being replaced with similar kinds of jobs in other places. So in this way we can see, I think, a pretty straightforward sort of exchange of what was domestic production and skills-based jobs here in the United States that have been moved elsewhere. Not exactly in a one-for-one fashion, but pretty much there's been a shifting of those kinds of jobs which have commanded higher pay previously that are being shipped elsewhere. And, of course, being paid more cheaply in those different labor markets abroad.
Diane, would you go back to explaining the deficit? I'm not sure that I really clearly understood what you meant by that. Could you go a little deep?
It might be a somewhat obtuse point, but when we say that we have a trade deficit with China, what we mean is we are importing more things from China than we are sending to China.
Right.
What are the things that we're importing from China? We're importing all of those things that are now made over there that used to be made here. The profits from the lower wages are coming to US corporations on Wall Street. So the trade deficit is really a measure of how much we've outsourced in a way, because we don't trade with products that originated in China. What we're doing is we're buying blue jeans and cars and whatever that were made there by what we think of as US manufacturers.
So it's not true trade, if you will.
That's the way I think of it. It's a measure of outsourcing.
Right.
When we talk about the trade deficit, it's a way
it's
of
almost a
quantifying.
semantics thing.
Yeah, it's a way of quantifying.
And a substantial portion of that trade deficit that she defines is actually created by Walmart.
Oh yes.
I don't remember the exact percentage of the trade deficit that Walmart is responsible for, but it is a substantial portion of it.
It is.
Well, there's one on every corner. I mean, geez, if you just Google Walmart in a map, you know. I mean, I was recently in Orlando and we were looking for, something. My sister wanted to stop at Walmart, and it was just all these blue dots, like represented by a blue dot. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm going to back up and ask what's maybe too fundamental of a question for this discussion, I don't know, but Could one of you define, when we talk middle class,
Yeah.
what do we mean? Is there a specific objective parameter? And then when we then talk about middle class in China and India, are we talking apples and oranges? Are these two different scenarios because it's different cultures and different economies? Or when we talk global middle class, should we be thinking the same way everywhere we talk about it? So that's a two-part question.
Good question.
It
Choose either one.
seems totally on point, and I was going to suggest we do the same thing, sort of back it up and think a little bit about what is social class or middle class in particular. But there is no objective way to define it necessarily. We define it in terms of how we want to try to understand folks who are sort of between the poorest and the richest people in a society. And when we think about class, we can define it in economic terms. We can talk about middle income people, for example. So how much money does a family bring in a certain interval of time? But we can also think about it in terms of wealth. You know, after they subtract all of their debts from their assets, what do they have left over? And we can think about class in relation to wealth. But we can also think about class in a sort of squishy way in relation to culture.
Squishy.
Yeah,
It's a highly technical term.
I love that term.
But it is pretty squishy.
Yeah, it's a soft measure.
Yeah, it's a soft measurement, but it has something to do with tastes, aspirations, even things like orientation to time. Especially, you know, we understand the social class system is a form of stratification, a kind of, you know, $5 sociological word, but these are sort of enduring hierarchies that exist in societies, and social class is one. And class systems replicate themselves over generations, from generation to generation. There's a certain amount of sedimentation then that takes place that we see in this replication over time. Cultures can develop in those spaces too, where we have generational poverty or wealth or generational middle class. We can really see that cultural part begin to really become more pronounced. You know, so when you think about class, it is squishy. You know, if a person is making at or about the median income for a household in the United States in the low 50s, if they fall, and they were sort of born and raised there, and their family was middle class over the last few generations, if they fall into poverty, are they a lower class person? Well, by income or wealth, perhaps. But in terms of culture and human capital and social skills and other things like that we know can purchase a lot in the economy, that person is not like a person who's in generational poverty at all.
Exactly.
They speak and live and believe in different ways.
And I think that's one thing that when I was teaching at NMC, I saw a lot, that if you were talking about income, most of our students would be considered poor.
Right.
But almost all of them came from somewhat middle-class families. And so the beliefs, the values, the understanding about investing in education, you might be temporarily financially poor, but by all of those other cultural measures, you come from the middle class and you're going back to the middle class.
Yeah.
So that's a very different thing.
So it's not just tangible money markers, it's an intangible kind of worldview that goes with being raised in that.
Well, it seems like in India in particular, I mean, they still today have the caste system, right? Where you're in a certain caste and you're there forever, right?
Yep.
You, your family, all of that. And we have this kind of belief in America that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and out of poverty and be one of those 1%ers. Is that part of the cultural?
That's part of the
kind of
cultural
our
belief
vision
system, but if you look at the data, of course, that's not. If you look statistically, the two groups that are most likely to stay where they started are the very top and the very bottom.
Yeah.
What mobility there is in the middle ranges, up and down. But if you grow up in poverty, you have a very high statistical probability of ending up there because of access to education and health and housing and all those things that go with it. And if you're at the very top, very few people are falling very far down from the top.
Right.
Because they have so many advantages and
Right.
parents' money inherited, all those kind of things to work with.
Yep.
So then when we talk middle class around the world too, we're talking about the same ideas that you just described it in the United States. That is, you're just looking at the middle. Those who aren't in poverty by the standards of the culture, those who aren't incredibly wealthy by the standard of the culture.
And it's the standard of the culture because, and Brandon's absolutely right, that it is a relative thing. Where do you stand in relation to other people in your society?
Yeah, okay.
And different values, different consumption standards, all of those things mean that middle class means something different everywhere you look.
Even within the United States, when we look at, say, the white middle class compared to the black middle class historically, what defined the black middle class wasn't necessarily income or wealth as an objective measure. It was really something more having to do with a certain level of independence, the ability to sort of make their way without having to tie into white institutions in the same way, and some of the sort of cultural aspects that were also relative to that group of people, or the degree to which a person or a family may have access to important white folks. It wasn't really about income. When we look at the so-called black middle class compared to the white middle class, these are different folks from an objective measure in terms of both wealth and income. But it's really something really more in relation to culture and related to the society. So if we think about what does middle class mean in India or China, I think it goes back to that notion of it's relative to the culture, that it's probably something about independence, really, which historically in the United States, when we think about middle class status, or the middling sorts as they were known in the 19th century, these were folks who were relatively independent. They weren't as tied into the traditional institutions and were able to sort of make a go of it themselves in a meaningful way.
So when we talk about the fall, we're experiencing the fall. Or maybe already at the bottom, I don't know.
Or a
Maybe
return
we're
to a previous distribution.
But as we're experiencing the fall of the middle class, then in all the terms that you would measure by, or maybe those things that are intangible, what would you say is happening as a sociologist? Looking in from the outside, what is happening that we're deeming it the fall of the middle class?
If you track the income distribution in the United States over time, and you look sort of in groups of 5 and see who's gaining and who's losing over time, probably the pivotal year is about 1980. The share of the income that went to the bottom 20% was at its highest in about 1967-ish, when it was 5.5% of the total income went to the bottom 20%. But 1980-ish was a very pivotal time when we really started to see that shift. And economists tell us that that's so for maybe 3 intertwined reasons. One of them is globalization. And the jobs that we lost out of the economy were jobs that supported people at middle class incomes and lifestyles without a lot of education, all those auto workers and such. So we lost those. That took a whole group of people and shifted them downward. Then we had, in addition to that, we had tax policies, very specific tax policies in 1980, 81 that reduced taxes to the people at the top and made our tax system more regressive so that it hit people at the bottom harder. So that was a big shift in income to the top because their taxes went down quite a lot. And the third aspect of policy was decisions about minimum wage and our unwillingness to track minimum wage with increases to the cost of living. So the minimum wage, what it used to buy relative to the cost of living, is very different now than what it used to be. So we've lost purchasing power because of the decline of the minimum wage. We've lost those sort of blue-collar jobs, I guess you would call them, that were outsourced. And then we, through tax policy, shifted a whole lot of income. So 1980, the top 20% of the United States got about 40% of the income. Today, it's 51%. That's how much we have shifted to the top. And the bottom that used to be 5.5% is now down to 3.5, something like that.
I thought for sure you were going to say one of those was cocaine and the sales of cocaine in the 80s. We're insane. Cash is being shifted around a lot in this country with drugs.
And on a serious level, all the statistics that we're talking about don't account for the people in prison.
No.
So think if all of those people were out on the street and most of them, many of them would likely be unemployed and poor. Our statistics would look a lot worse than they do just because we take some of the most vulnerable people and don't count them at all.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
So it strikes me that there's a tension in the list that you gave, or at least to me there's a tension, probably because I don't understand it. And that is, on the one hand, wages were not increasing in a way that kept pace with the cost of living. On the other hand, jobs are being outsourced because you can buy cheaper labor overseas. It seems like then the more that you would increase wages over here, the more people would outsource, and you just exacerbate the problem.
Well, that's the argument for not raising the minimum wage. Yeah.
So what do you think of that argument?
I'm
not even arguing for
really,
it. I'm just curious about it.
That's a really tough one. I think that in our country, we need to pay commensurate with our cost of living. And that would mean increasing that minimum wage. Now, you are right that that might fuel more movement overseas, although I think most of what's going to go is gone. And in fact, some of it's starting to come back. And because capital moves looking for wherever labor is cheapest and wherever the exchange rate is best, we have folks that outsourced first to Mexico, but then Mexico's wages started to rise. And so then they move to the Philippines, and then the Philippines' wages start to rise, and then they go to China. So it's a pursuit, a global pursuit of lowest possible wages and best possible exchange rates currency-wise.
Yeah, when these trade deals are negotiated abroad, in addition to that, the flight of capital to cheaper labor spaces, there are also ways in which those countries where multinational corporations wish to do business will formulate the deals in such a way to try to give them best returns on savings. So if they put their money in their banks in that location, they'll get the best competitive savings rates. If they're given loans, or if they give loans, those interest rates are also go along with that in a beneficial way to those companies. So it's the labor, but it's also the other things that we might not pay quite as much attention that make some places really look quite promising as a place to move. But I think from a political standpoint, and it's a political season, so I guess we ought to probably put it in somehow.
I've got candidates on my list.
Do we have to?
There you go. Is there the same kind? It seems like there's a growing awareness, a la Trump and Bernie Sanders, about how America is sort of losing in these international trade deals. And
30 years and they finally catch up with sociological literature, right?
They're trying to figure. They're getting around to the party. But now that there's broader awareness of this, is there going to be a taste? I think it's just going to get progressively harder for presidents to be able to lobby for fast-track authority on international trade deals. I think there's going to be more examination of that process generally in the American public, which really through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, most Americans just did not register. It was not on their radar. But I think that the changing political climate is really making this broader awareness much greater. And I think that politicians will pay greater prices if they continue to support multinational corporations who are looking to expatriate their capital for the purpose of making money on the backs of the American middle class. I just don't think the taste is going to be there in the same way, especially if people get politically active.
Well, you also mentioned, Diane, the tax law is one of the three things that you brought to the table. And it seems like that double-edged sword, right? You can make a really good argument for it, but who wants their taxes raised? Who wants to pay more taxes? So how do you think this will play out in this broader conversation that's going on in politics today? I haven't heard much of it lately. Sure have heard a lot of harping on trade and globalization, but not the tax issue. Minimum wage comes up, but...
Yeah, the tax issue, I think, is a question of what goes on quietly behind closed doors, for the most part. And the people that have political and economic power are in a position to keep their taxes low and argue for those for reducing. And when we lose that revenue, then of course we have to figure out where we're going to cut the budget. And the people who don't have political power are the people who need those other social support programs the most. And so, I mean, we saw this in Michigan too, that the price of the tax cut for the top is usually a reduction of services at the bottom.
Right.
But I don't think you see as much, well, Bernie Sanders is directing a lot of attention to tax policy. But other than that, you don't really hear people address whether the top is paying their fair share. You know?
So let's talk about trickle-down economics.
All right.
So the idea, if I understand correctly, is that if you have a flourishing, wealthy class, they will be more inclined to start businesses, spend their money, that will trickle down, hire employees, et cetera, and that if you cut the taxes or you do whatever so that the wealthy flourish, then those who are in the most poverty will eventually benefit. Is that something that actually plays out in real life, or is what we're suggesting in this discussion of the middle class is that the solution to those in poverty is going to come from the middle class, not the upper class in terms of money?
And can I add?
Are you going there, Brandon?
Well, you
I think
mean
we'll
in
both have to take a turn.
a closed system. I mean, that's a theory that might hold true in a closed system, but with globalization, that's the problem, right? Expand on that.
Definitely complicates things. It definitely complicates things. You know, the notion is yes, you know, if you have this flourishing group of people at the top that they're going to spend, they're going to create jobs and that sort of thing, but that isn't like fixed in stone. I think one of the things that my brothers and sisters in the social science of economics, they tend to think of the economy as having natural laws almost, that there are these that they operate almost like physics operates or something like that, and social systems really don't function that way. It's not fixed in stone that if you have a flourishing upper class that they're going to spend and that's going to somehow trickle down, because just look at the situation right now. Companies have a bunch of money on the sidelines, trillions of dollars on the sidelines. Banks have trillions of dollars on the sidelines that they're not lending out to stimulate the economy. That right there sort of proves that there's some kind of chink in the trickle-down economy armor. Because there are conditions where folks just are going to tighten up their wallets and say, well, nah, we're not so sure. The reason why it gets pointed to right now is mostly because of the so-called uncertainty in the market. Right, that the political changes that are taking place, policies in Washington, are seen by the movers and shakers as not being quite as in line with what they would like to see, predictable in the way that they'd like to see it. So they're tightening up their purse strings, and that trickling down is certainly not happening these days.
Yeah. So it's a theory. People say, well, you know, look at what happened in 1963 and 4 when we cut taxes and the economy flourished. Well, there again, at that time, when you cut taxes, that money stayed in the United States. And people may have invested them in businesses and growing businesses. But what happens now when you cut taxes at the top is you just open up more capital to go overseas. People are not going to invest in new manufacturing or jobs here. The financial sector is they're going to invest it, they're going to be in the stock market, they're going to put it in international banks. So the idea that what you give to the top is going to fuel enough domestic economy to provide jobs for our people, especially the lowest people, the poorest people, it just doesn't work that way in a global economy in the same way that it did maybe when we had a much more isolated economy.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that what might have had merit as a tax plan 40, 50, 60 years ago no longer does, simply because the global situation has changed.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that it was the most efficient or effective way even 30, 40, 50 years ago, but it's certainly not effective at all now.
Yeah, the same notion that I think fueled Ford's realization of the $5 a day, which, by the way, only came after tons of union pressure. He did not pay the $5 a day ahead of the threat of unionization. It was only upon the threat of unionization that happened. But the notion behind Ford's inkling is sort of a refute of trickle-down economics, in fact. The notion instead is that it's sort of the best economy is the one that trickles up. If you put the money, if you put more money in the hands of working class people spend much more closely to 100% of the income that they make. They don't have money to save. They're putting it out. That stimulates the economy. Upper classes spend out considerably less than 100% of their money. If we had some situation where the rich spent money like the poor in the economy, trickle-down economics might actually work. But instead, no, they end up saving 60%. Okay. And then that ends up creating greater economic polarization, which is what we see. The Pew Research Council, or Pew Research Center actually just came out with a study at the end of last year that looked at the situation of the middle class and it's shrinking. For the first time since 1970, the middle class as a group, in the way that they defined it, is smaller than the other classes combined for the first time since 1970. And what they found was greater polarization. The changes that we see is that the growth at the top and the growth at the bottom is centering at the very top and at the very bottom. It seems that the middle class is shrinking, and there's a growth in the number of people who are very poor and very rich. And again, bringing it back to this notion of trickle-down economics, if we have all of these new millionaires and billionaires, where's the positive impact on the economy for the middle class? The numbers don't bear it out.
And the other thing is, when you think about that the middle class is shrinking, the question is, where are they going? And what happens is some of them are falling down into the poorer group and some of them are moving up to the higher income group. And that has a lot to do with investment in education and all the social and cultural capital, things like that. But a lot of people who were tenuously hanging on to the middle class are now what we would consider to be at the bottom. And that's so, of course, the middle class is shrinking if more is going in either direction.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there's been any studies about how technology is affecting this. If I remember correctly, with the rise of the computer age, a lot of the discussion was how this would put information into everybody's hands now, and even just the jobs that were available within the industry. I mean, I know plenty of people who've never gone to college and they're whiz programmers and they're making great money. But it seems like even as technology rises, those promises early on of this idea that it would make the world accessible to everybody doesn't seem to be panning out, almost as if it's creating a new type of division between people, the haves and the have-nots in terms of your ability to manipulate or use technology. Would that be fair to say?
I would say, and we see this even among NMC students. We are supposed to be preparing students for a global economy, and we're supposed to be preparing students to transfer to universities. And that means that when you get past NMC, people are going to assume that you have computer skills. But many of our students don't have computers. Or if they have computers, they don't have internet access at home. And so that's an important consideration when we move to put more and more things online. We mean that there are a group of people who are going to spend more time in the library because they don't have access to internet at home.
Yeah, that digital divide.
So we see that even here.
Yeah, definitely. The digital divide is still with us very much. In the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was really more about access to the internet, and today it's really more about access to the devices that can get you to the internet. More today. But the other thing on the technology piece that I think is important to consider is the mechanization of labor. You know, yes, it's true, as Diane said, that capital will follow the cheaper labor markets, and some of that has begun. The manufacturing has begun to circle back, and that's being repatriated. Is coming back at half of what people were being paid in the 70s and 80s, we should say. But the other thing that's happened in that interval is that robotics and technology are also replacing people, right? I mean, it happens like my smartphone replaces secretaries, robots replace line laborers. And that's something that we have to take into consideration too. Not only are the manufacturing jobs that have circled back to the United States, not only are they paying less, but they're able to do more with fewer workers. So productivity remains high, but the total number of workers employed does not. Another piece of the technology piece, which is kind of also related to education, is that most of the boom that has fueled the economic, I guess the positive gains of the economy in the United States are in two primary sectors, technology and financial. Both of those areas require higher education to be able to get into. Yeah, there are lots of folks who don't go to college who become whiz-bang programmers and entrepreneurially kind of move themselves forward, but for the lot of people, you need to have an education. And one of the big variables that we see in the distribution of income today is really related to returns to education. That those folks, especially in my generation, Generation Xers who got college degrees and entered the labor market, they're making more money with the same degree than people in previous generations made in these sectors like in finance and technology. So it's creating a bigger gap from an educational perspective too that I think is important to understand.
So if globalization, it sounds like, from everything we've said so far, is a big fat negative for the U.S. middle class. But
For the U.S. middle class, it has not been good.
it's not been good.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, and what do I know, but if our economy is based on consumerism, or has been historically, haven't we kind of created another big reserve of consumers then that weren't there historically in China and India?
Absolutely.
Are they
Sure
kind
have.
of okay?
That's
so
exactly what I
do
was-
we need to do to tap into that then? If we are still essentially have a little bit of a lead as a global leader here, in that, what needs to happen for us to take advantage of that there are more consumers on the planet?
It depends on who you mean by us, because United States-based corporations are definitely taking advantage of that. As I was talking about earlier, that consumers in the United States become less important as the process of globalization increases income and the growth of the middle class, especially in China and India, because their populations are so huge by comparison to us. How that benefits the average person in the United States, I think, is a lot tougher to try to justify. So the original idea of these trade agreements was, yes, we're going to lose some of those blue-collar jobs, but in the end, we are going to get all the advanced jobs. Our economy is going to flourish with better jobs. Because we're going to get because we're going to get the technology. I don't think we can out-technology Japan. So, but that was the idea.
Yeah,
was
we
that,
would
well, we're
become
going to
the
let
brains of the economy.
we're going to let those junk jobs go anyway, and
right.
everybody's going to be better off because everybody will get an education and get good technology jobs and all that.
Well, if we look at this from a truly philosophical standpoint, should we care if we have a middle class at all in the United States? I mean, if you
philosophically, that's open to judgment.
And that depends
it's
on who
about
the we
it's about
is.
values, I think, too. I mean, philosophically, we could look at the morality of it, and we could say, we could use words like should. It should be this way, or it should be that way. But economically and politically and socially, there are a lot of justifications for why we should care if there's a middle class. The middle class is the major counterweight. We know that two-tier societies are less stable. All we have to do is look through history and around the world, and two-tier societies are less stable over time. That the economies don't flourish in the same kind of way. So from an economic, and then of course you get social stability out of this too. If people are proud to be American, if they're proud of the jobs that they have, if they're proud as a culture and a society of the contributions that they make to the world, socially, politically, economically, we have greater social solidarity. We have fewer divisions in Lansing and Washington, D.C., for example. So I think that there are a lot of less philosophical reasons for us to care. But from a morality standpoint, I think we can also make judgments there about whether or not it's right that the current distribution of income and wealth is set where it is, that we could and should do it differently. And I would tend to agree with that. In America, when we go back to the time of Ford and compare it to the time of Walton, in the time of Ford, the CEO to worker pay ratios were something very much more of what we see in Europe today, 30, 40, 50, 60 to 1. But in the United States today, under the Walton regime, if we will, it's more like 300 to 400 to 1. That is a major change. And we have lots of reasons, I think, that we could make moral and philosophical arguments that that kind of inequity is unjust, and that we should be examining that.
Is it really the inequity, or is it the level of poverty? Meaning that do people have their basic needs met? Are they having to work 80-hour weeks just to feed and clothe their children? Is that, I mean, when you talk about that inequality, is that where we're going? I mean, the middle class, as you said, that's, you know, kind of being pushed down into that lower into that poverty range because they're no longer unable to get a job that pays enough to have a house and one car and whatever we hadn't had in the 50s until the 80s or whatnot. I mean, that's definitely a moral issue.
It is. It is that people, I mean, people may be working 2 and 3 jobs. We have this impression that poor people don't work.
That they're lazy.
They're lazy.
Right, yes.
But they're working 2 and 3 jobs to try to make ends meet.
Right.
The argument that I hear most often when we start talking about the income distribution is people say, but if this is the way the market economy works out, then that's what the United States is based on. And how can you justify taking away from people what they rightfully earned themselves up at the top and redistributing it and giving it to other people who didn't earn it? And of course, the obvious answer to that is that the existing income distribution is not the invisible hand. You know, it is what it is because of specific policies.
Absolutely.
So it was specific policy choices that got us here, and therefore it's not a perversion of capitalism to make some other policy choices to lessen that difference. But there seems to be this idea that the folks at the top got it fair and square, and so they have a right to keep it, and taxation is a form of theft of what people earned and then giving it to folks who didn't earn it.
Yeah, that's right.
And in essence, the corollary would probably be then that those who are the poorest earned that fair and square, and everybody's gotten what they deserved.
Right.
Which is far from the truth.
Because we have equal opportunity.
Yeah.
And after all, discrimination was outlawed in 1964, so if everything isn't better by now, it must be their fault.
Do you think we need better, I mean, maybe we just need better verbiage. I mean, when we talk about, again, the Sam Walton regime, if you will, and the folks that are working there and working 2, 3 jobs, and they're still on assistance because it's still just not enough, right? So doesn't that really mean that the rest of the folks, through taxes or however, are actually supporting the profit then that the Waltons are making?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
So when you talk about policies and income distribution, how do we describe this scenario then to those who would say, well, they earned what they deserve and they get what they deserve? There's got to be a better way to explain it then, to what's really happening there.
Yes. I mean, I think people are coming to understand more that what we are doing is subsidizing profits of the Waltons by using all of our collective taxpayer money to underwrite their low wage structure by food stamps and income support and, you know, all those things. So really, that's one of those public policy things. We are filling the gap with public dollars because we are letting the folks who are supposedly the job creators, letting them get away with not paying people enough, and then we, through public support systems, make up the difference.
I think, let me jump in here really quick. If we circle back and we go back into history and we look at sort of what were the earlier conceptions of the American dream, when we try to think about maybe how we can repackage this notion of a different distribution of income and wealth, I think that if we return back to this notion that we had of the American dream that was characteristic of the 19th century, where really it was about independence, kind of in the way that we were talking about the differences between the white middle class and the black middle class, or maybe what the middle class looks like in India. It's really about independence. It's about the ability to have enough that a family can sort of roll with the punches of change, which change is pretty much the only constant, and especially in the United States. That this kind of independence, the dream was really that families would have enough to be able to, roll with the punches and change with the times in a way that would be secure enough for them to be able to set themselves up, set their kids up with some sense, that they would be able to sort of keep the ball rolling in the right direction, meaning greater security for subsequent generations. I think we have to get back to the previous notion of the American dream, which was really about independence and middle class security, and away from what I would characterize as a perversion of the American dream story in the 20th century, which was very much about materialism and the attainment of wealth. there's not enough to go around. We're not all going to achieve the American dream if it's all about wealth. That's not going to happen. But we can all achieve the American dream if it's about security and independence. And it seems to me that independence from a cultural standpoint is really what America's all about. Self-sufficiency and independence. But in order to be able to do that, you have to have a certain resource base. Without that resource base, you can't be independent. It's not about work ethic. It's about you have access to the resources necessary to remain independent and to maintain that. And I think if we return to that previous definition of the American dream in our repackaging, I think that would go over like hotcakes in America. Frankly.
And how would we do that?
I think
The psyche of entire culture.
it's $1 million question.
It's the conversation. It's people like all of us having this kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're doing it right now.
People thinking about this more as the political season is upon us, and you hear all these different candidates proposing all these different things. You have to start thinking for yourself a whole lot more about the moral questions, the ethical questions. What should the goal really be? And it's very interesting, your point about independence, because that seems in the United States as you move to middle class, you move more and more to the traditional nuclear family because you can be more independent.
Yeah, you can afford it.
The lower income, you are more likely to stay in an extended family context because you reduce the risk. You increase the risk pool, basically.
Yeah.
And you substitute also friends, people in kin relationships that trade and help each other out back and forth and everything. So the idea of independence, in some people would say, is about the loss of family ties, about traditional nuclear families, each one standing by themselves, and with Social Security and things like that, helping the elderly to stay by themselves so the children don't have to support them. So we really also have to think a lot about what exactly do we mean by independence? What kind of independence do we want? Because we do still want strong family ties. We do still want strong family supports. So independence doesn't necessarily mean just what we think of as the nuclear family being independent. It's maybe whole family systems being able to be self-sufficient.
So maybe you're suggesting that to achieve an economic independence or an independence from the government or being subservient to others requires an increased dependence on extended family or friends or some type of self-chosen community that bolsters you, and maybe a trade-off of the independence that you're looking for?
I think that traditionally that's how people with less income have solved their problem of having less income, is by having wider exchange networks, things like that.
Yeah, the rise.
And then the self-sufficiency is the middle class view of, yeah, I can help people anytime I want to, but my first responsibility is to take care of my nuclear family and put us on that trajectory.
Yeah. You know, in the 19th century, that notion of the American dream included a notion of the potential for home ownership. And when we fast forward into the 20th century, especially after World War II, the notion of the American dream and home ownership became completely intertwined at that point. And really, that was also, when we look at the demographics of it, the greatest period of time where the two-parent nuclear family flourished was in the boom economy after World War II, because there were enough resources on the table, on the kitchen tables, literally, of family homes, that made it possible to sustain that kind of family arrangement, which is really very expensive in comparison to the extended family network that Diane was just describing.
And it's a very short window in our history.
Very short window. We tend to think of the nuclear family in the United States culturally as something that's kind of goes back to through the mists of time almost. But that's not in fact true at all. And when we think about it too, part of the rise of this great nation based on immigration as it was, people were coming to the United States with this dream in mind, that when they looked across the pond and they saw the United States, they saw a great deal of material wealth being transferred to everyday citizens, that everyday people were able to live in ways that might have been more characteristic of the wealthiest people in the countries from where they hailed before immigrating. And the hope for home ownership is what fueled people to come here. And I think that that's something that is just so in the sort of cultural DNA of the United States that I think it could speak to people. Frankly, I just don't think it would take that much to be able to re-pitch this notion of the American dream to the people, because I think that people are already getting there, and with as deeply as this is sewn into our psyches, the tie between resources and the nuclear family arrangement, our desire to have that, the desire to have self-sufficient, independent people who don't rely on other institutions in society, there's so much to like about a different distribution of income and wealth in America that I think that a lot of folks would get on board pretty quickly.
It sounds like, to some degree, to a new message of change, for some people will always be a hard message. If I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're in essence saying to, say, the person who wants to start a business, are you willing to not make 200% more or 200 times what your employees make? Are you willing to make 30 times and literally give them more money? And I don't know, do you think the best way to do that is something where you give a compelling message and simply get people to buy in? Do you think it's going to require the government to increasingly step in and force the hand? I mean, that certainly doesn't sound ideal, but can you anticipate?
It doesn't sound American, but in Europe, those things are regulated by law.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
In Europe, they are regulated by law. And the big debate in the legislative bodies is not, should we establish that ratio or should we not? It's how big should that ratio be?
Okay.
And it's not just about people. You make it sound as if it's this business owner who's, John Smith or whomever, and then all the employees and they're his friends or not his friends. But isn't it really more about the idea of corporations that have a quarterly report, they're looking at the bottom line? It's so far from personal that it's almost as if you can ask, are these people morally corrupt? But they're not. They're so unattached, or just so far from the actual working people of that company. Then their job is this, to watch this bottom line, to make this decision about that. Isn't that part of the bigger issue as well?
Yeah.
We can't. That's why regulations have to be brought in.
And I'd like to take this in a little different philosophical step as well, talking about that distance between the quarterly financial reports and the dividends to the stockholders and things like that. When you buy a car, the first time when you buy that car, your money is going to help that Ford or General Motors or whoever. Ever after that, when you buy and sell on the used car market, it's basically speculation and trade between people that has nothing to do with whether it helps General Motors or not. And stocks are similar. If there's an initial purchase offer, those people are making a direct investment in the company. Everything else on the stock market is buying and selling and trading existing shares. So now we have people who feel like they have a right to the profits of a company who really have invested nothing in the company itself.
Right. They bought a used car.
They bought a used car, and there it is. So we don't ever stop to question whether the first primary obligation of a corporation is to create profits for the stockholders. We just assume that that's a given. But why would those absentee stockholders have more claim than the workers who actually produced it?
And that's a topic for a whole nother conversation on a whole other show. Which is very interesting. I'd love to have you back. We are running out of time, so we better not go down that rabbit hole. As far as the rise and fall of the middle class, I feel like we covered it. We don't always solve anything, but we sure bring up a lot of a lot of good points. Any last thing you're just dying to throw on the table before we
I think we have to
goodbye?
figure out culturally, politically, and economically how we can bring multinational corporations, international banks more to heel. I will say that. We have sort of gone under this premise in the last 100 years that corporations, that we've given them personhood. We've given them a passport and said that they can travel abroad and do as they see fit as free persons. I think that has been a problem. We have to understand that corporations are institutions of a society meant to address ongoing economic needs, and we have to bring them back and repatriate the work that they do. That might mean government intervention, but it's also going to mean political action on the part of citizens who are demanding something different. That's how we do it.
Anything to add?
No, Brandon says it.
Encapsulated it
I'm
beautifully. Well, thank you for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you very
for
much.
joining us
I enjoyed it.
again.
Always fun.
And thank you at home for watching us here at In Focus.